Is it just me, or do we not really talk about Bioshock Infinite anymore? Not as much as I would expect, at least. It was one of the most anticipated games for multiple years, released in 2013 to critical acclaim, nearly unanimous 9s out of 10 across the board, and garnered more awards than I can count. Everybody was crazy about Bioshock Infinite, but like a zealot of the lady, one day I turned around and it had just vanished from conversation, at least in my remote corner of the gaming community. The first Bioshock still regularly emerges in narrative and philosophical discussions, but Infinite, a seemingly brighter talking point, seems to have burnt out. Maybe its pros are too obvious, because when it's brought up for a countdown or a video essay, it's usually for one of its setbacks. The lack of any true boss fights, the less preferred two-weapon system, and the depictions of racism are maybe a little too good, making it awkward perhaps to revisit. I mean, it clearly condemns the behavior, though for a story so concerned with the plight of marginalized groups, our heroes are still white people. But there are two issues I see crop up the most. The first is the ending. Well, the story in general. It's confusing, and it's really proud of how confusing it is. The open-ended finale mystified a lot of players, who had to trade in their guns for the campaign's last 20 minutes for a heaping plate full of existential dread. The second was a controversy with the game's cover at the time. Fans who followed the game's development felt that the generic dude with gun on the front failed to convey what made Infinite special. 2K Games opting instead to reassure customers that this was, in fact, a shooter. More contentiously, they relegated Elizabeth, considered by artistic director Ken Levine to be the heart and soul of the game, to the back of the box. One has to wonder if they feared their target demographic wouldn't buy a game with a non-sexualized woman on the cover. A similar thing happened with The Last of Us the same year, actually. Sony told Naughty Dog to make the cover just Joel, but in this case the devs insisted on keeping Ellie with him, as that was their artistic vision. You can argue the ethics and marketing of this, but something about this always stuck with me. Like many games at the time, the plot revolves around a woman of special significance, but casts a man as the lead, giving him more agency in the story, and usually turning out that he's also of deeper significance. Bioshock Infinite is told from Booker's point of view. It's his story, his game. And let me make clear, I don't think this is a flaw in Bioshock Infinite, which is up there as one of my favorite games of all time. I love it as it is. But the trend does get tiresome, so for the sake of experimentation, what if it was Elizabeth's game? Elizabeth's story? What if we took everything that happens in Bioshock Infinite, without changing the plot in the slightest, and shifted our perspective, treating Elizabeth as the one acting on the narrative instead of the other way around? Would that help elucidate the more convoluted moments of the last act? Would any new themes emerge? What if this is Elizabeth's story already and we're just looking at it wrong? Granted, this video will be most valuable to people who've played the game already, and will feature some heavy spoilers for both it and the original Bioshock. In fact, using Elizabeth's last name is a bit of a spoiler already, but one that I think is pretty obvious and is revealed in the first third of the game. So without further ado, let's try to linearize the twisting timescale of Columbia. This is Character Study.
Presented by ComicFoil. Welcome to Character Study. Choose your character. Elizabeth Comstock. Game set.
Before we dive in, it's important we have a basic understanding of not only Elizabeth, but the game series she derives from. The original Bioshock is a first-person shooter with RPG elements and a light horror bent, released in 2007 and written by Ken Levine. Bioshock follows silent protagonist Jack, who after surviving a fortuitous plane crash finds his way to the underwater city of Rapture, or at least what's left of it. The game was celebrated for its unsettling atmosphere and the most famous plot twist in video game history. Elements like the superhuman plasmid abilities and steampunk monsters became unmistakable marks of the brand. There was a direct sequel which was pretty good. I like it well enough, though Ken Levine didn't work on it and it won't serve much purpose in our discussion today. Levine instead helmed the third game in the series, Bioshock Infinite, which at first seems like a complete reboot. Instead of a 1940s city beneath the waves, we have a turn-of-the-century colony above the clouds. And instead of ghostly girls protected by diving suit cyborgs, we have one young woman guarded by a giant cybernetic bird monster. We play as war veteran turned private eye Booker DeWitt, who's been hired for reasons he's a little hazy on to rescue and relocate that young woman to New York. Her name is Elizabeth, and with Booker being a non-silent protagonist, the relationship between the two of them becomes the emotional core of this high-flying odyssey. Elizabeth was emphasized as a major aspect of Infinite since the game's first trailer. In interviews, Levine explains that the player's investment in the game's story would hinge on her, but understood that some players are just here for the action, and wouldn't engage with the story anyway. With that in mind, Elizabeth's in-game behavior was made to interfere with the player as little as possible, and the result is one of the best companion characters of all time. The majority of Infinite is, in essence, an escort mission, a term that makes most seasoned gamers a little wary, quickly. Generally, having another character to protect just adds an extra fail condition to the table. If your charge moves too slowly or dies in one hit, the game can rapidly grow frustrating. Elizabeth is no such liability. She's always right on your heels, she's effectively impervious to damage, and the enemies don't target her anyway. In this way, she's a lot like Alex Vance from Half-Life 2, one of Levine's inspirations. But unlike Alex, Elizabeth isn't so much of a combatant. Instead, she supports Booker by opening locks and randomly finding health, money, and ammo. Elizabeth also has a superpower. Due to a unique origin story, Elizabeth is able to open portals, or tears, between realities, allowing her to manifest helpful objects, including cover, supplies, robot allies, and all manner of terrain advantages. But although this is Elizabeth's power, it's activated manually by the player when they aim at these tears, so effectively it's your power. Elizabeth is designed to stay out of the player's way and act exclusively to the player's benefit, so you can swashbuckle your way through enemies and environments without concern for your unkillable ally. You could argue this makes Elizabeth feel more subordinate, there purely for the empowerment of a male character, but for the sake of forward momentum it works well, and the programmers went to great lengths to make Elizabeth feel truly autonomous. She examines things in the environment, reads the signs, coughs at the cigar smoke, her demeanor changes depending on her current mood in the story. There's an illusion that she has her own free will. Hold that thought. And I know we've come a long way in the 8 years since Infinite's release, it's easier to see the stitches now, but I'd say she makes the AI sidekick Hall of Fame. In terms of personality, that's a little harder to pin down, not because of any failure in the writing, but because of the complexity of the game's high-concept plot. That's okay, it's what we're here to decipher. Suffice it to say, Elizabeth is extremely intelligent and versatile. Her time locked in a library equips her with a myriad of skills in science and mechanics, and geography. Heck, she can recognize a destination just by its latitudinal coordinates. But her naivete betrays her sheltered upbringing. She has a staunch determination, even if what she's determined to do can change on a dime. And we see many signs of her throughout the journey. It's clear she's still figuring herself out, a common trait in younger characters. Maybe the speed of her character development is a bit unrealistic, a lot of it happening in about a day's time, but I think that can be forgiven to fit the needs of such a breakneck action game. And big props to her voice actress Courtney Draper for selling all these character beats. I was surprised to not see a bigger catalog on her IMDb page. She's an incredibly talented vocalist and holds her own alongside the legendary Troy Baker. Those of you who've watched the other 5 episodes of Character Study know I like to use characters as a jumping off point for other topics. And the Bioshock series has some pretty big topics staring me in the face. In Bioshock 1, Rapture is used as a critique of objectivism, a socio-political outlook that believes all people's first duty is to themselves, and that the only purpose of a government should be to protect its people's personal freedoms, to let them do as they wish unregulated. A discussion of Bioshock 1 is not complete without talking about objectivism. In Bioshock Infinite, Columbia's flaws lie instead in American exceptionalism, an outlook that perceived the US as clandestine to lead the rest of the planet to the next era, leading to a lot of sycophants who think everyone needs to be exactly like them. There's a lot of social commentary across these two games, but behind that lies an even bigger philosophical payload. The concept of determinism. Every Bioshock analysis worth its atom is based around this concept, making me hesitant to retread the same ground. But it's going to be very difficult to get a complete picture of Elizabeth without at least a surface understanding of determinism, and I think I can break it down in a convenient, engaging way. So would you kindly humor me while I get this determinism thing out of the way? Next section.
Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. Familiar phrase.
In the midway point of the first Bioshock, it's revealed that your character Jack has been acting under the hypnotic influence of Frank Fontaine, aka Atlas, the entire time. The plane crash was no accident at all, and a trigger phrase was being used to nudge the player down the path to kill Andrew Ryan. Besides the observation that most video games are really just puppeting the player down a specific path, Bioshock posits that, like a game, one's life is dictated by forces far beyond their understanding. Would you kindly is spoken like a question, but it's really a command. An illusion of choice that blinds you to the uncontrollable nature of life. This is called determinism, and it stands in stark opposition to the concept of free will. For inspiration on this video, I asked my followers on Twitter if they believe in free will, or if everything was fated to happen in certain ways. And in retrospect, this was an awful thing to do to an unsuspecting viewer base on a Saturday morning. But I got some profound responses. I did notice a lot of people bring up the possible existence of God to support or refute free will, and while that's certainly related to Columbia's zealous populace, that's only part of the puzzle that is fatalism, belief and adherence of fate. This derives, like everything else I talk about, from ancient Greeks. The Greeks even personified fate as a trio of sisters who could see the future, not to mention tales of prophets giving perfect forecasts. Tiresias divined that Oedipus Rex would would kill his father, so his dad Laius tried to have the baby killed, only for him to instead be readopted and unknowingly fulfill that prophecy. The more you try to squirm, the harder fate binds you. We mere humans have no escape. As for a god, or gods, that specifically would be called omniscient fatalism, a belief that there is a higher power that controls or predicts fate. But for all you agnostics out there, we also have physical fatalism, or causal determinism, that events within a given paradigm are bound by causality, in such a way that any state of an object or event is completely determined by a prior state. This is looking at the fate of the world more like a set of dominoes, everything happening by some cause to achieve some effect, bound in science and reason. And for the record, these two aren't mutually exclusive, but despite all the religious allegory, Bioshock is mainly concerned with the scientific side of the argument.
Booker, are you afraid of God?
No. I'm afraid of you.
Determinism was played around with by Aristotle, who preached we must understand the consequences of our actions, but later philosophers knew those consequences weren't always so easy to predict. Take Zeno of Citium, for example, who survived his boat sinking and, much like Bioshock's Jack, had to swim his way to a fantastical new city. Zeno washed up in Athens, where he fell in love with the works of Socrates, and came to believe that his shipwreck had happened for a glorious purpose. Zeno would become the first of many Greek and Roman philosophers known as the Stoics, though it's not like they all knew each other, they weren't like a boy band or something. But their ideas all followed similar themes of living commendable lives in a wildly chaotic world. If you want to take determinism a step further, predeterminism states that since every event happens as the result of a previous event, then actually, everything that's going to happen was already determined at the start, and we have no hope of stopping it. In fact, any hope we think we have or decision we think we're making may just be part of that system, the synapses of our brain responding to previous stimuli, influencing us to behave in a predetermined way. And is it getting harder to breathe in here, or is it just me? Now, it's obvious how Bioshock's Will You Kindly relates to this. Your perceived choices weren't really your own, and it was all set up, until the point that Tannenbaum helps you disable your psychic conditioning. Free will wins! Right? Well, I don't know, because after your emancipation, you're still just following the incredibly linear sequence of events. You're just changing where the prompts come from. And I'm not even sure if 2K intended this irony or not. Well, at least you have an ongoing moral choice you get to make yourself of what to do with the little sisters. Every time you capture one, you can either save them or, and I know you would never do this, kill them and harvest their atom to get stronger. A pretty smart way of tempting the player by giving the immoral option some practical benefits, though you still get rewards for freeing them, so at least this changes the final cutscene. Great job, you chose not to commit repeated child murder. You did choose that, right? Bioshock Infinite takes this idea a step further, Elizabeth's reality-hopping powers being the key. This gives her, roll credits, infinite ways to deal with a problem. Theoretically, she can keep jumping timelines until she gets the result she wants. But much to her horror, no, infinite does not mean boundless, and certain constants and variables will always be in place. There's always an evil Comstock of some type threatening the world, and there's only one way to deal with a Comstock. Everyone is trapped in a cycle of violence and bloodshed, and the game is as linear as ever. There's not even a little sister morality game this time. Instead, as if to rub salt in the wound, Infinite gives you choices that affect absolutely nothing. Throw the ball at the prisoner or the carnival broker. Doesn't matter, you'll get interrupted either way. Ooh, which pendant should Elizabeth get? It's purely cosmetic. Oh, and the fact that the path forks here at the Sea of Doors only to go to the same place, that's so mean! I really never had a choice, did I? The game gives you a button prompt to hand over to Wit's baby, as if you're the one responsible, but it's not like you can not hand her over. There's no other way to proceed. It's still your choice, but it's not one you actually make, and this coin flip always comes up heads. This little experiment is performed by the Lutece siblings, brilliant scientists who invented the first reality warping device. There's a Lutece in every reality, and in my research, I found the Lutece in our reality. A French philosopher named Pierre-Simon Laplace. Oh, sorry, he would prefer you call him a mathematician. It's true, most of his achievements were in the sciences, tracking the celestial physics of planets, revolutionizing how we look at probability, helping to invent the metric system, thanks for that, and he took a very mathematical approach to life which wraps determinism up in a nice little bow. So let's say you flip a coin. What are the odds you get heads? 50-50, right? Well, Laplace would argue you only think it's 50-50 because you're bad at physics. In actuality, there are forces of gravity, friction, and air resistance acting on the coin that, if you could calculate them correctly, you could flip the coin in such a way that it would land heads every time. Furthermore, Laplace claims that if there could exist an intelligence that perfectly understood all of these laws of physics, it would be able to predict the outcome of every event for the rest of time. Every dice roll, every gotcha pull, everything you will say and do because you yourself are just a complex psychological program. Laplace's contemporaries would later refer to this intelligence as Laplace's demon, a name Laplace didn't really like, but let's remember it for now. Laplace's demon. This will be on the test. Granted, more recent science challenges this outlook. In the field of quantum mechanics, it's been found that particles are able to act in a completely unforeseeable way, a quality referred to as indeterminacy. This would seem to disprove Laplace's beliefs. But then you start to get into string theory. Basically, in all these events where a particle can truly respond in multiple ways, there could exist a reality for each possible outcome. If this is true, then the possibilities are Bioshock Infinite, just not necessarily all that different from one another. All the same particles are there, they just might vary in what they actually do. Does that make sense? Well, who cares if it makes sense? Even if all history is just an ongoing chemical reaction, we're not smart enough to see the dominoes anyway, and I'm sick of determinism dominating the conversation around this game. This video isn't about a bunch of old male philosophers and physicists. It's about Elizabeth. We're making this her story. So for our next section, we'll be following Elizabeth's path through Bioshock Infinite from beginning to end. She warps space and time a lot along the way, but if we follow her consciousness through it, we should be able to track the lessons she learns, and how they shape and mold her character. Then maybe we can finally make some sense of this ending. Let's get started. Here come the spoilers. Now it's true Elizabeth doesn't know her own origin story until very late in the game, but for the sake of clarity, I'll start with her birth. Our heroine is born under the name Anna DeWitt in New York, 1893, daughter of Booker DeWitt. That's the big twist of the game. Sorry. Booker drowned his wartime PTSD in booze and gambling, accruing an inescapable amount of debt, and was coerced into selling his daughter to make enough money. Give us the girl and wipe away the debt, they said. The buyer in question, Booker DeWitt, from another dimension. This version of Booker found post-war redemption as a born-again Christian. Changing his name to Zachary Comstock, he became a religious authority and the ruler of Columbia, the city in the sky that seceded from the American Union thanks to the technological advancements of the Lutece twins on his payroll. But his participation in the Lutece experiments left Comstock unable to conceive a child, so using the reality-jumping Lutece machine, Comstock has Anna stolen from, let's call it Timeline 0, and claims her as his daughter in Timeline 1. At the last minute, Booker Zero, the character we play as in the game, tries to prevent Anna's egress, failing and causing Anna to lose part of her right pinky finger. This Booker would later be abducted to the same timeline by the Luteces, with much of his memory about the situation boggled. Anna is renamed Elizabeth Comstock, and the public of Columbia is led to believe she was a miracle virgin birth, hailing her as the Lamb of the Prophet that would one day lead Columbia to a new age. Unfortunately, Comstock had a wife, whose name was Annabelle to make this extra confusing. She didn't understand this trans-dimensional technology and assumed the baby was born from an affair between Comstock and Lutece. She wanted nothing to do with her husband's bastard and demanded it be sent away. To make matters worse, baby Elizabeth's temporal relocation at such a young age endowed her with strange powers. This needed to be studied, so Elizabeth was locked away in the Tower of Monument Island, learning of neither her true parents or her fake ones. Annabelle Comstock would later be murdered to keep her quiet on the whole situation. As far back as Elizabeth could remember, she had no one. Sometimes doctors came to poke and pry at her, but for the most part she was alone with her books. Then, one day, a huge creature crashed into her tower. It was scary at first, but Elizabeth saw it was dying. Thanks to some mechanics books Elizabeth had read, she was able to repair the giant, and it became her closest friend for a time. As the years went on, Elizabeth busied herself by reading, appreciating art, and studying blueprints. With a little ingenuity, she began to think she might be able to leave her tower, but anytime she tried, the songbird would stop her. What once seemed like her only companion was, in actuality, the warden to her prison. But like the sad children in her storybooks, Elizabeth realized she was magic. If Elizabeth focused really hard, she could see tears in the space around her, and jump through them to visit fantastic locales, her favorite being Paris, though her fear of the songbird always brought her back in time for dinner. Her powers grew and grew as the years went by. She could even create the tears herself into worlds she created, but it wasn't real. At least she didn't think so. And once she got to be a certain age, when her powers seemed at their strongest, they suddenly stopped. Now she could only open small tears already present, which rarely appeared in her tower. How could she have known that those keeping her captive had built a siphon below her in a secret ploy to limit her abilities? Around her 20th birthday, Elizabeth had given up on escape. She could never do it alone, and Songbird wasn't going to help her. That's when a stranger literally dropped into her life and changed it forever. A fellow named Booker DeWitt. And this is where Elizabeth's adventure begins in earnest. Elizabeth has little time to think. It's now or never. So she agrees to follow Booker, narrowly escaping Songbird's pursuit. Elizabeth and Booker are knocked from the sky, but fortunately land not far below in the artificial ocean of Battleship Bay. It's hard not to see Elizabeth as a Disney princess as she explores the town for the first time, dancing with the locals while a carnival rendition of Girls Just Wanna Have Fun plays in the background. There's so much to see along the way she can hardly stay focused, until Booker tells her the best news ever. He's taking her to Paris. The real Paris. But her childlike wonder is cut short at the gondolas when guards try to stop Booker. A gunfight erupts, and this man she thought was her savior murders them all. Understandably, Elizabeth's shocked. Her envisioned fairy tale didn't include so much blood, but Booker apologetically gives Elizabeth her first lesson. The world is dangerous, and conflict is inevitable. Elizabeth reluctantly continues to follow Booker, her idealized view of him irreparably broken. Their escape plan takes them through the Hall of Heroes, where Elizabeth learns a bit more about Booker's past as they confront his old blood brother, Cornelius Slate. This reinforces her previous lesson. Not only is conflict inevitable, but sometimes violence is the only solution. Looking through the museum, Elizabeth ascertains her identity as Comstock's daughter pretty easily. Thinking this must mean she was unwanted to be kept in the tower, this darkens Elizabeth's worldview, not helped when, upon finally securing an airship, Elizabeth realizes Booker's been lying about Paris this whole time, and has been contracted to take her to New York. Lesson 3, no one can really be trusted. But Lesson 4 is learned shortly after, as Elizabeth runs away from Booker, with some inventive uses of her terror ability. She gets momentarily captured by more guards, but it ends up being Elizabeth who saves Booker from falling to his death. She then realizes she's the one with power in this relationship. She's the reality warper, and she's the one Booker needs to complete his job. Keeping this in mind, she continues working with Booker, but no longer strictly following him. This also makes Elizabeth maybe a little more rebellious. To get their ride home, the duo is conscripted to help the Vox Populi, a radical working-class insurgency. And here's where the timeline goes cockeyed. Chen Lin, the gunsmith they need, is dead. So newly empowered Elizabeth, who's political now and wants to help the revolution, opens a portal to a timeline where he's not dead. Timeline 2, let's say. But not only is Chen Lin all discombobulated now, the result of remembering his death in another history, all of the gun-making tools are stolen by the founders. So Lizzie jumps again to timeline 3 where they're not stolen, and she says this line.
Booker, if the Vox get their weapons, there's going to be a revolution just like Les Miserables. These people are gonna have better lives.
So, I get it, this is meant to juxtapose the dark turn this is about to take, and she loves Parisian media, but Elizabeth, did you finish reading Les Miserables? Because it doesn't end well. Sure enough, things here are worse than ever. Chen Lin is dead again, the Vox Populi are destroying Columbia, and to save a little boy from being executed, Elizabeth has to kill their leader, Daisy Fitzroy, with a pair of freaking scissors. The lessons here? Be careful what you wish for, with great power comes great responsibility, and sometimes, anything you might do to help a situation is just gonna make it worse. Elizabeth drops into a pit of nihilism, deciding, forget Columbia. I can't help anyone anyway. Let's just do what we gotta do to get out of here and end this story. This includes grave robbing. To fool a fingerprint scanner, Elizabeth decides to exhume the body of her late mother Annabelle, but due to a trap that makes her powers go haywire, Elizabeth ends up summoning the ghost of Lady Comstock. Or rather, she manifests a phantom made up of her own fear and hatred of Lady Comstock. To pacify the spirit, Elizabeth has to investigate into some tears around Emporia, learn how her mother was mistreated and murdered, empathize with and ultimately forgive her for sequestering her to live in a tower. The lesson? Sometimes good people do bad things, and sometimes those bad things are part of a cycle of mistreatment. Responding to negativity and pain, Elizabeth realizes that she can generate yet more negativity and pain that gets inflicted on others. It's up to each one of us to break the cycle. Taking this lesson to heart, Elizabeth lets go of her grudge against Booker. By now, the two are peers. Friends, even. Not to be outdone, her old bestie Songbird returns to kill Booker, and Elizabeth offers herself in exchange for Booker's life. Strap in for some more quantum entanglement as Booker never manages to save Elizabeth. Try as he might, Songbird always stops him. Elizabeth is incarcerated for the rest of her life by Father Comstock, tortured and re-educated. She holds out hope for a time, but it becomes more apparent Booker isn't coming to save her. She even begins to think Booker just left. Lesson 10, accept your fate. There really is no way out. And sadly, this lesson overwrites the previous 9. She follows in her father's footsteps, taking over Columbia and leading it to an airstrike that destroys New York City in 1980. Yep, supervillain Elizabeth. But in her old age, Elizabeth realizes the mistakes she's made, and decides that to set things right, her best hope will be her first hope. Booker. So using her powers again, she pulls Booker from the past, right after Songbird recaptured her, shows him this darkest timeline, and sends him back again with a coded message for younger Elizabeth, thus creating a new timeline. So I guess this is technically a new Elizabeth too? Elizabeth Prime? Yeah, strike that last lesson. Elizabeth Prime didn't accept that. But this Liz has still been captured and tortured for an unknown amount of time. Long enough to be really bitter about it. Though I have to wonder why she's wearing the same dress she was abducted in. You weirdos really didn't have a surgery gown for her? Was the corset supposed to be part of the torture? Because as tight as those things are, I think she's used to it by now. Anyway, Booker frees her, she does the coolest hair trick yet, sucking her captors into a vortex, and she now has a new goal above escape, killing Comstock and ending this once and for all. Nothing can be right while Comstock still lives. They confront Comstock, he begins to tell Elizabeth that maybe she shouldn't be trusting this Booker, but before anyone can get a straight explanation what he means, Booker freaks out and kills Comstock. This gives Elizabeth some complicated feelings, like she didn't really get any closure on the subject of killing her own abuser, but she doesn't have much time to think about it. Using the notes from sad future Elizabeth, sad present Elizabeth discovers how to control Songbird and uses him to finally destroy the siphon blocking her powers, and things get all kinds of freaky. Not only are Elizabeth's powers restored, she can now see through the doors of all realities with complete omniscience, and she confirms what she's come to suspect. Booker is Comstock. And given the lessons she's learned along the way, she sees it as her responsibility to end the cycle and set things right. The sad thing is, she hardly blames Booker. It was his choices that started this path, but choices he was never in control of. Everything must go. Songbird is drowned in the murky darkness of Rapture, that's a fun callback. And finally, Elizabeth takes Booker to where he first changed his name to Comstock and kills him. Closing the book on Bioshock Infinite. I gotta say, this hasn't really made the ending any clearer for me. I mean, if you're looking at this as Booker's story, I understand why it stops here. The story ends when Booker ends. But what does it mean? Are all of the Elizabeths disappearing? What will happen in Columbia? This is just a vague puddle of ambiguity. Well, what did we learn from Elizabeth's perspective? Let's see, blah blah blah, inevitable, only solution, using your powers, changing things makes things worse, cycles, and in the end, Elizabeth accepts her fate. Killing Booker is the only way to set things right. This was all about determinism. Elizabeth's story is just learning to accept the clockwork machinations of the world. That even with all of her power, with the infinite possibilities, some things were constant and could only be solved in a certain way. I thought I could make this video about something else, but it was always going to be about determinism, wasn't it? It's the only way. Okay, no. No, goddammit! This is a video about Elizabeth! We can still make this work! I mean, we haven't even touched the DLC yet, Burial at Sea. It may have swam under some players' sonar, but this DLC is essential material if you want any kind of closure on these events. Not only does Burial at Sea double down on the themes of causality and cycles, it gives Elizabeth the starring role many players wanted for her in the main game. This two-part miniature sequel is set in Rapture, the city from the original Bioshock. In Part 1, you still play as Booker, but a new version of Booker, who is visited by an older, colder Elizabeth, who is revealed to be the same Elizabeth. And although the player is kept in the dark for most of it, we eventually get some answers as to what happened at the end of Infinite. After destroying the siphon and gaining a songbird's eye view of all realities, Elizabeth kind of became Laplace's demon, or Laplace's angel? By resolving or creating this paradox, Elizabeth and her parallel versions merged into one multiversal entity that could see all, know all, and recall the experiences of any of her multiple lives. For example, in one version of her abduction backstory, Elizabeth lost her entire head instead of just a finger. So Elizabeth travels to this Booker's life, which has been relocated to Rapture, as part of her crusade to wipe all Comstocks off of the face of the multiverse. Now understanding the harm caused by every person and their actions, this version of Elizabeth is jaded and cruel. Plus she smokes, the ultimate sign of moral ambiguity. It's not enough that she killed this subnautical Booker, she has to make his poor, reality-confused mind remember what he did first. Because he didn't remember. The Lutesses wiped this Booker's brain after the beheading incident. Don't worry about it. So Elizabeth brings up Sally, an orphan girl Booker's been caring for out of guilt, now missing. Elizabeth offers to help Booker find her, just to show him she's become a little sister, and let him be impaled by a big daddy just as he truly realizes his culpability in all this. Elizabeth's ability to manipulate people in this chapter, knowing exactly how they'll respond to what she says, is chilling. Like her flirting with this man in the record store. Kind of hard to watch when you remember the bright-eyed innocent you picked up on Monument Island. And her plan to rescue Sally involves super overheating the vent she's hiding in. It's the only way, Liz says. Yeah, the only way to what? But it looks like the Big Daddy didn't like Elizabeth's plan either. In his rage, he kills Elizabeth as well, and what happens when a multiversal entity dies? Turns out it's not that big a deal. She can go on living in any other dimension she chooses, including her fake picturesque Paris. She just can't go back to the world she died in. Only problem is, Elizabeth feels really guilty for what she did to Sally. The whole revenge plot against Booker caused Sally to fall into the clutches of Atlas, the villain from the first game. So in a philosophically unprecedented move, Elizabeth returns to the Rapture timeline, meaning she can never use her tearing powers again, meaning she's back to being an ordinary, mortal girl. She can remember everything she's done up till now, that she was omnipowerful, but she can no longer remember what she saw through any of the other doors. Essentially, Elizabeth became Laplace's demon, but sacrificed it to do the right thing. And that kinda blows my mind. Granted, when she decides to do this, Elizabeth sees how it's all going to end. But once she's back in her mortal shoes, she can't remember. Rather, she just has to trust that her Laplacian self knew it would work out. Burial at Sea Part 2 finally makes Elizabeth a playable character. It really is her game, and she plays nothing like Booker. This is more of a stealth game, utilizing Elizabeth's intelligence and mechanical know-how to tackle challenges. Elizabeth outmaneuvers Sue Chong and Andrew Ryan, and travels back and forth between Columbia. She comes to realize that many moments in her life that she thought were random, such as her helping Songbird as a child or having to kill Daisy Fitzroy, were actually set up for her. Choices she thought she was making were merely manipulations. Elizabeth is joined on this adventure by an imaginary Booker, a manifestation of Elizabeth's doubt and grief. But with hindsight, she finds a new sympathy for him and realizes how his actions, for better and worse, molded her into who she is now. And as the DLC chapter progresses, the player slowly realizes they're setting the stage for the original Bioshock to happen. Raising Fontaine Industries back to Rapture, completing the bonding process of Big Daddies and Little Sisters, even handing Atlas the Would You Kindly code. And apparently at some point before losing her powers, Elizabeth caused Jack's plane to crash. Not sure when she did that, honestly. Elizabeth saves Sally in the end, and all her hard work earns her a lethal blow to the head. But as she dies, she gets one last glimpse of the future she helped to cement, and is surprised to see Booker? No, Jack, this world's actual Booker, saving Sally and the other orphan girls in the good ending of Bioshock 1. And content in the promise of Sally's well-being, Elizabeth closes her eyes for the final time. For all final times. While Elizabeth laments the limitations of her choices throughout the second part, her decision to ultimately do what's best for Sally, a girl in a similar position to what she started in, speaks to the core of Elizabeth's character. Part 2 manages to re-establish a few thematic staples of the Bioshock series to highlight this. Your first task as a reconstituted mortal is to sneak through a Rapture day camp, where Andrew Ryan's mascot, in classic objectivist style, condemns altruism, or the act of selflessness, as short-sighted and ultimately bad for society. Basically, Andrew Ryan says don't help others. But when Andrew Ryan offers Elizabeth an out later in the story, Elizabeth spits in his face, choosing altruism over self-preservation. And when being interrogated by Atlas and threatened with a transorbital lobotomy, Elizabeth calls his bluff, saying the destruction of her mind would probably make her happier. After all, at this point Elizabeth's already given up ultimate knowledge and, in theory, ultimate freedom, and neither really improve her life. Laplace was a smart guy and all, helped us understand the universe a lot better, but he never really taught us to be happy, did he? Maybe the trick to navigating this predetermined world is further back in history. I want to draw attention to an audio log that Elizabeth makes after her capture, on her path to becoming the evil empress that destroys New York.
I suppose the siphon is a kind of leash. Yes, my father put it on me. But when the time came, neither did I remove it myself. What would happen if I took off the leash? And I found I was as obedient as ever.
Okay, that's pretty grim, but the idea of a leash got me thinking back to Zeno and the Stoics. These chaps came from all walks of life, one being a peasant, another emperor of Rome, a third killed by the emperor of Rome. These guys knew how crazy life could be, and found the key to enjoying it was understanding that it could all go wrong at any moment. They took a determinist outlook not to give up on life, but as a way to excuse themselves when things go wrong. It's alright, Seneca, it's not your fault Nero put you to death, life just be like that sometimes. But they were also able to balance determinism with aspiration. Marcus Aurelius especially wrote one of the most valuable texts on the subject of ethical philosophy. He believed you had to do your best to be your best self, so you could be prepared when it was the universe's turn to take the reins. Or should I say, the leash. In developing Stoicism, Zeno asked us to picture a dog tied to a cart as it travels down the road. Some Sometimes it wants to follow, and so it does effortlessly. Other times it tries to go a different way and is dragged along. Despite this being a monstrous thing to do to a poor dog, we need to see ourselves as this dog. We can't fight against the cart, that's a losing battle, but we can try to understand the road it is on, and with the length of the leash we have, do our best to avoid unnecessary tugging, lead the way from time to time, maybe even sniff a few hydrants along the way. We can't stop the rain, but we can look at the sky and try to dress appropriately. Is our decision to bring an umbrella just our predetermined reaction to precipitation? Well, we're not Laplace's demon, so it's not like we can know anyway. Predict what you can, and where you can't, be confident in your own decisions. And for Elizabeth, even though she can't control what happens to Rapture after she dies, it doesn't mean it's all going to be bad. If Bioshock Infinite asks the question, do we have free will? Elizabeth's answer is a resounding, probably not, but whatever. This is what I want to do. Who cares why I want to do it?
Guitar. You can picture happy gatherings round the fireside long ago, and you think of tearful partings when they left you here below. Will the circle be unbroken by and by? By and by is a better home awaiting in the sky, in the sky.
The song Elizabeth sings here is a cover of a pre-existing song. Will the Circle Be Unbroken is a Christian hymn written in 1907 by Ada R. Habershon and Charles H. Gabriel, and I think it really encapsulates this game and this character. Not only does it refer to a better land in the sky, which adds an extra bittersweet pang, it's about cycles. It was written as a funeral hymn, saying farewell to loved ones past with the hope that their love can still be felt in our lives, and can be passed down to future generations. Even the song itself is an example of this, most famously reworked in the 1930s by A.P. Carter at the start of the country music craze, and transformed by dozens of great artists before appearing in this game. But in Bioshock, the circle takes on a new meaning. Not only families over generations, but people influencing and harming one another through different timelines. Sins in the future setting up reactions in the past, a circle that can't be broken. Not through a Lutece device or tearing powers or prophets or siphons. But maybe it can be unbroken, strengthened by the small choices we make for each other. The timeline bit we did was fun, seeing how complicated it could get, but if we stop fooling around and think of this story as the journey of a character, it's actually quite simple. Elizabeth was alone in the world. She met someone who changed her life forever. Traveling with him, she learned the world was dangerous, but she learned how to fight. She learned to be wary and careful. She learned she had power, and she learned her actions had consequences. She learned she could make mistakes, and she learned to forgive the mistakes of others. She learned that she wanted to break the cycle, but that to a certain extent, you have to accept what will be. She learned these lessons from an older friend, and she left them behind to one younger. The circle wasn't broken. I can't tell you with any authority that anything is predetermined, and I hope I didn't give anybody an existential crisis with this video, but I can assure you, you won't be in control of every situation. What matters is you do your best for the people whose lives you affect. In truth, it never bothered me how Bioshock Infinite told its story, that it was confusing, that Booker was the playable character instead of Elizabeth. I think Booker's skill set fit the kind of game 2K was comfortable making. They could have just given that skill set to Elizabeth, sure, but then she wouldn't be Elizabeth. And ironically, playing as Booker just gives us a better view of Elizabeth, as her worldview is shattered and she slowly reassembles it. I guess the reason why Infinite's story always worked for me is because I played it when the DLC was already out, and to me, it already was Elizabeth's story. A story about coming of age, being dealt some bad hands and playing them anyway. Maybe the shuffle wasn't technically random, but hey, can we really tell the difference? We're only human, and that's not such a bad thing to be. Hey everybody, ComicFoil here. Thank you so much for watching. I'm so sorry this took so long to come out. It took me like 4 months, but I took a bit of a break after Oscar and I did Weapons Month 5, and as you can see, this was kind of a big undertaking. A lot of research, a lot of editing. If I can, I'd like to try and get 2 more episodes of Character Study out before the end of the year. One of them, I swear, will probably be that one that Oscar and I have been planning to make for a while. The other one will be something else. But first there are some serious credits in order. While all the footage of Bioshock Infinite was from my own recording, I did not have time to collect my own higher-end footage of the first Bioshock game. That I got from Materwelonz, who is a Let's Player. She actually has all of the Bioshock games Let's Played, so if you'd like to get more into this series but don't feel like buying the games, that is an excellent option for you. Give her a watch. This acoustic cover of Will the Circle Be Unbroken is being played by Nathan Mills. He's a musician with his own channel, Beyond the Guitar. He plays a lot of really awesome sci-fi guitar covers, and he writes and sells the sheet music, so if you play guitar and you want to play this, you can be as cool as Booker DeWitt without giving up your firstborn child. The character study logo was designed by Tales of Sojalo. The announcer voice in the intro was of course the GreenScorpion, and the intro music was Cascade by Kubbi. I'm gonna take a couple short days off before jumping into work on the next one. I will let you know when I'm finished.